Hey guys, today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, the Vietnam War. If we were in class, we would spend days talking about this. We would read an entire book, actually, based on the Vietnam War. Fortunately, we don't have that kind of time, so we're going to do a really brief overview of what Nam looked like, why we got involved, and the effects of that. So Vietnam. Objective question, what were the international and domestic impacts of the Vietnam War? And when I'm asking you for domestic impacts, I'm talking about the United States, not so much Vietnam. For our focus in this United States history class, international effects or impacts are obviously what happens to Vietnam, right? Domestic impacts are changes in our own country. I did want to include this. For a while, or for a very, very long time, the Vietnam War, the conflict in Vietnam, was the longest war that the United States had ever been involved in. Recently, however, the conflict in Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, has passed that. Updated, the Vietnam is now the second longest conflict the United States has ever been involved in. So a really, really long time, right? 17 and nearly a half years of conflict. Okay, so the Vietnam War, when we look at it, can be divided into different phases. The first phase doesn't really apply much to the United States, but we need to go over it to put it into context of how phase 2 started. So phase 1, Vietnam is a portion of French Indochina. This is an area that France controls over on the Asian coast, and the people of Vietnam decide that during World War II, when France is distracted with, all the stuff going on in Europe, now would be a great time to rebel and gain their own independence. And their leader is a man named Ho Chi Minh. Hang on, where are my maps? Here we are. Vietnam's this pink kind of semicircle kind of thing, this curved thing on the edge of this peninsula. And as I mentioned, the leader right here, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is a communist. He believes that Vietnam should rebel from France, get their independence, and then become a communist country. Now, obviously, we've got this communist down here making noise, so obviously the big communist countries are going to back him up. So the USSR, the Soviet Union, and China are going to support Ho Chi Minh in his quest for, freedom, independence, and forming a communist state. Now, Vietnam eventually does gain its independence. France fought them very, very hard, and after a series of huge losses, France finally says, fine, Vietnam, you can be free. However, you're going to be free on our own terms. And what they end up doing is dividing the nation of Vietnam in two. And the northern portion goes to Ho Chi Minh, and the southern portion is going to be a democratic country led by a man named Diem that the United States supports. This is once again just an extension of Cold War. It's the North versus the South, the free versus the communist, and that's exactly how this whole thing's set up. Now remember the domino theory, the idea that if one country falls, the rest will follow. South Vietnam, the free portion, the non-communist portion, is now an extremely important domino, because if South Vietnam falls, according to the domino theory, other Asian nations surrounding it will fall too. And if South Vietnam falls, it proves the domino theory to be correct, because North Vietnam is communist. So once again, we see the dominoes falling. I've added this, excuse me, this bullet point at the bottom. Long story short, northern portion of Vietnam is communist, southern portion of Vietnam is free. You've heard this before because this is exactly what Korea looked like. Northern being communist, southern being free. All right, so that's the first phase. Phase 2 is when America actually gets involved. So now we've set the stage. Vietnam's divided in half free, half communist. Now, we'd been in kind of keeping our eye on Vietnam for a while now, under Eisenhower and JFK. We'd been aware of what's going on in Vietnam, but we hadn't quite gotten involved yet. This changes underneath LBJ. Underneath LBJ's administration, an incident occurs that becomes referred to as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin is an area, okay, and the incident is what happens there. Allegedly, some American destroyers were fired upon by North Vietnamese torpedo ships. Now, who fired first? It depends who you ask. Well, hang on. where's my long story short? Here we go. Long story short, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is what finally gave America the green light to join the conflict. Remember, we never actually declare war on Vietnam. Since World War II, America has not officially declared war on countries. Now, we've been involved in plenty of conflicts, right? But we haven't officially declared war. So LBJ does not declare war on Vietnam. Instead, he uses the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is very sketchy. The details are very shady. There's a couple documentaries about exactly how much of it actually occurred. Very long story short, the Americans claim they were shot at by the North Vietnamese. They fly back to friendly waters. They do an inspection, and there's one tiny little dent from a Vietnam bullet. Now, had we fired at the North Vietnamese? Yes. Did we fire first? Yes. Did they end up putting a little ding in our boat? Yes. Was that enough for us to go to war? According to Congress, yes. So because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, LBJ gets support to send American troops and personnel to Vietnam. This is now a, conflict between us and the North Vietnamese. Now, issues that the Americans had in Vietnam. We are fighting alongside the South Vietnamese. So they are our allies, the South. That's the free part, right? Are now fighting against the North. But the North has two different groups that we're fighting against. One is the North Vietnamese Army. This is the, regulated, army that's fighting for the communists. But there's also a more kind of like, how do I describe it? Guerrilla-like warfare, kind of less structured. Think of them as like the Minutemen, right, of our country, or the militia, right? They're not part of the army, but they're fighters just as much, and they actually cause a lot more problems for us. They fight in the guerrilla-style warfare that we've talked about before. They give us a lot of issues. The Americans historically have never really fought well against guerrilla tactics. And the Viet Cong, that's their strong suit there. So they're hiding in the jungles. They have underground tunnels. They know the land a lot more than us, obviously. And then their biggest advantage is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Where's my map? Here it is. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was basically a kind of like underground supply line for the Viet Cong. So they would run supplies from North Vietnam, obviously, where the communists are, down into where we're fighting. And they would continue to resupply these Viet Cong. So the Viet Cong would literally live in the jungle, right? And then every couple of weeks would meet up at some area of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and be resupplied. They'd get more ammunition, food, supplies that they need, and then they'd disappear back into the jungle. This was super hard for Americans to shut down because it was all so disorganized. If you're out of the loop. If you're in the loop, it makes perfect sense. Show up to certain places, get your supplies. For those out of the loop like us and the South Vietnamese, it was very, very hard to shut down. Turning point in the Vietnam War is the Tet Offensive. So Tet is a holiday, kind of similar to Christmas, and we kind of wagered that there's no way there would be large-scale attacks around this holiday. We figured that everyone would kind of just de-escalate for a couple days and take Tet off. The Viet Cong bet on this, right? And they actually end up attacking all throughout the country on this major holiday, and they took out a ton of Americans and South Vietnamese. Hang on a second. So anyway, huge win for the Viet Cong for North Vietnam. Really bad look for the Americans. Also, the Vietnam War is interesting in another way that it's the TV war. Prior to this, Americans had kind of sat at home and they would read about World War I, World War II in newspapers, and that would be the extent of their information. But now that television is more common, what we have are people who go to Vietnam to film this, and instead of reading 1,000 American deaths in the newspaper, which is sad, instead they're seeing American bodies laid out on the street. They're seeing blood. They're seeing innocent children crying. And it starts to hit home a lot more for Americans that this is something really, really serious. And not just is it serious, but the Americans actually don't look like the heroes any longer. This picture down here, this is a very infamous event where the South Vietnamese captured a Viet Cong member, and without a trial, without any kind of due process or anything, he was shot in the head right there on TV. And the Americans were absolutely horrified. We're fighting alongside people who are willing to, without any kind of due process or anything, kill people. This is freaking us out. this is really the turning point for the American kind of mindset onto whether or not Vietnam is good or bad. A lot of people turn against the war at this point. Also, we have some horrible massacres that occur. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This was a really bad look for America. The My Lai massacre. We walked into a village and just started killing people for literally no reason. We also developed a couple new weapons that are going to help us basically decimate. Here we go. Those first two pictures of people are attributed to the My Lai massacre. This one right here is an example of Agent Orange. So napalm and Agent Orange. Napalm is basically kind of like sticky fire, is the best way to explain it. It's stuff that sticks to you and it's extremely flammable, so you flame up and you can't really brush it off or tap it out. It's very, very bad, very, very devastating, not just for people, but homes and vegetation and stuff like that. A secondary weapon that we also use a lot of in Vietnam is Agent Orange. What it's going to do is it's basically going to kill all the plants and trees and stuff. The reason we're using this is not just because we like to destroy the environment, but because the plants and the trees and stuff are what the Viet Cong are hiding in. So if we destroy that stuff, we'll be able to find them better. Obviously, that's going to cause a lot of issues for the people living in this area. A lot of their vegetation is going to, be destroyed with this, which means that starvation is going to rise. And there's a lot of birth defects that come out of the Agent Orange. Here's some people whose conditions are attributed to their contact with Agent Orange or napalm. More things. I'm trying to talk faster because we're starting to run out of time. Division at home is going to be huge. A new thing called counterculture is going to evolve. These are people who nowadays we refer to as hippies, flower children. You see them in Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump has a lot of those examples. There were some protests, hawks versus doves. We have people in our country who are pro-war. They support the troops, support America. Those are hawks. We have people who don't like the war, who like to have peace and love, all that stuff. The hippies, those are doves. Also, we have the Kent State Massacre. What anniversary was it? It was a couple days ago was the anniversary of this event. But the Kent State Massacre, some students at Kent State were having a protest and a National Guardsman fired into the crowd and 4 people died. A very infamous picture down there at the bottom too. This was just a lack in judgment. You can pause that if you care to read it, but I'm going to move forward. Draft card burning is going to be a kind of a statement that people who are against the war are going to do. Now, can the country still track you down? Yes. All right, this is more of a symbolic gesture than anything else. Draft dodgers. So there are some things that will get you exempt from military service. Remember, at this point, all men, once they turn 18, have to register for the draft. Some ways you can be exempt from that if you're a conscientious objector. If you have a religion that says that, it makes it so you are against war, you can get out of that way. If you're currently a student in college, you don't have to go. If you have some kind of medical problem or a mental problem, that would, and also if you are homosexual, the military doesn't want you there. Lastly, you could have an essential occupation. You could be doing something that's so important at home that you literally can't leave. Some examples of this, Muhammad Ali actually loses his titles over refusing to fight. Ted Nugent poops in his pants when he goes to the draft agency, smokes some crystal meth, and then they deem that he is not someone they want in the military. So another way to dodge the draft. Also going on, guys, I'm talking so fast, I'm freaking out. Okay, the credibility gap starts to grow. LBJ is saying, hey, yeah, war's going great, we just need some more men. And people are saying, I don't think so, because it's a television war. We can tell that we don't think he's really telling us the truth. LBJ loses popularity, and even though he can run again since he took over JFK's first term and then won once, he could run again. He decides not to. Instead, Richard Nixon, remember Eisenhower's vice president, says, listen, I want to win this with peace, with honor. We start to withdraw. The policy is called Vietnamization. It's having South Vietnam take more responsibility, and we gradually pull ourselves out of the war and say, South Vietnam, it's up to you. Which leads us to the third phase, which is literally a civil war between the North and the South. North easily defeats the South. It doesn't take very long at all. The United States doesn't send any help at all. We abandon our embassy in Saigon. It gets taken over, renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and Vietnam is now one communist country together. Impacts, oh my God, effects of the Vietnam War. A lot of Americans are killed. No one's really happy to see them when they come home. This is a huge loss for America. This is a huge loss for the, free portion, the democratic portion of the Cold War. It's a win for communism. We distrust politics. It's a huge divide in America. There's hippies. Many view Vietnam as a complete waste of time, money, manpower. And this is Vietnam after. All right, I just flew through that. Answer your objective questions. Okay, bye. Love you.